fact, what I would like to do is take you on a little journey from the collège de Bernardins to the global parliament of mayors. It's actually a short trip because this is a place where cosmopolitan ideas are the currency of what has happened here and what will happen here. And I want to make an argument this evening for you about cosmopolitanism, about the role that cities can play in global governance. But let me start by saying something we all know all too well from just a few days ago, once again. We know that democracy in Europe is in crisis. We know that stability, certainty about our future, safety, sécurité, they are in crisis. If you look at the American primary elections, I need only say two words to tell you that American democracy is in crisis. Donald Trump. That says all too much, I fear, but it does now look like he will win the Republican nomination. I don't believe he will win the presidency, but the fact that such a man can be nominated to a major party signals, again, the crisis in democracy. We know in North Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, there's a crisis in governance. Modern nation states, which have been with us for 400 years, l'État, nation, contrat social, these great notions we find in Rousseau and in Locke. For 400 years, they have done us well. They have been founders and conservators of democracy. They have been guarantors of our life, our liberty, and our property. But we know, looking at Paris twice last year, Brussels a few days ago, that the nation state no longer can guarantee the life, liberty, and property of its citizens. And let me remind you of something we often forget about the social contract. We obey government. Rousseau says this, Locke says this, Hobbes says this, the American founders say this. We obey government only because it assures our life, liberty, and property. That's the social contract. And clearly we live in times when the nation state can no longer guarantee our life, our liberty, and our property. And that is a terrible crisis. And signals what I call in the book décadence, that was the translation. I'm not sure décadence is quite the right word, but the default of sovereignty. The gradual failure of nation states in the 21st century. And it's not just insecurity that nation states are failing us. Think of climate change. Finally, after 20 years in COP21, we got an agreement. But it took 20 years, and during those 20 years, temperatures went up, climate began to change, extreme weather happened, and now, despite the rather vague but promising agreement, scientists agree if the nation states from Paris do everything they promised, it will not be half enough to deal with the threat of sea rise. Because even the 2 degrees of warming they expect means 10 to 15 meters of sea rise. And it means that we will lose a lot of our coastal cities around the world to the sea. So not just in terrorism and security, but in climate change. States are no longer doing the job. Or the third problem you all deal with too, because many of you are in corporations and firms and banks, the problem of global inequality. On the other side of Donald Trump, we have a candidate, Senator Sanders, who, quite remarkably, is arguing about closing Wall Street and stopping the big banks. That would have been unthinkable years ago. But inequality has become so radical, even in the United States, that politicians who in 200 years never used the word socialism in America are now running for the presidency as socialists and be well received. 10 years ago, they would have been laughed at. And again, that's because global inequality, inequality within nations, inequality between nations, has grown, and we look at runaway markets, we look at banks that have often stopped serving the community with loans for business and loans for homes and started speculating in bad mortgages, in hedge funds, where the only goal is to make money, whatever happens to the public sector. And again, that's caused a crisis in confidence in institutions, in public institutions and in private institutions. In short, there is a crisis in governance, which is also a crisis in democracy. If you ask young people, if you ask people of color, if you ask unmarried women, if you ask gay people, do you think democracy works? You can ask that question in Syria, in Egypt, in America, in Brazil, or in France. A large majority of them will say no. They have become cynical about the democratic process, which to me is a great tragedy. So what are we to do with this crisis in governance, this crisis in democracy, this crisis in inequality? And how can we do it together? Because the worst part of the crisis for me is that the public and the private sector, government and the market, political institutions and private firms and banks and corporations are part of the problem. We have ideologies that say, choose up. You believe in the free market or you believe in government, you can't have both. And to me, that's a disaster. Because we only flourish as a people, as communities, when the two work together. And in fact, there's actually three. It's state, or government call it, civil society, and the market. We need all three to make things work. So how do we return to a position where those three sectors work together again, where democracy works again, and where states and the public sector, with the help of the other two, can begin once again to solve problems, provide security, deal with poverty, take on climate change? How do we do that? Now, for 50 years, I've been writing about and studying democracy. So I'm not an urbanist. I'm not a cities person. But I come to cities because when I look around and say, is there a political institution that can respond to the crisis, that can respond to climate change, to refugees, to security problems, that can deal with the private and the public sector and make them partners, not enemies? My answer is that is already happening in the world's cities. The government of cities, the banks and firms of cities, civil society inside cities, foundations in cities, are already working more effectively than nation states are. And perhaps, to put it very bluntly and simply, we need to figure out how mayors can play a greater role in governing the world, how cities can become part of a global government structure. Obviously not replace states, not replace the UN, not replace the G8, not replace the institutions built on states like the World Bank and the IMF, but can play a powerful complementary role in helping to solve problems, in giving young people faith and participation in democracy, and dealing with issues like security, like climate change, like poverty, like inequality, like refugees. Is that possible? And that led me to write this book. It's Si les maires gouvernaient, but it's really Si les grandes villes, si les métropoles gouvernaient. It's the mayors are the symbol of the city, but it's really about cities. And why cities are different than states, and why mayors are different than chancellors and prime ministers, and why the citizens of cities are different than the citizens of nation states. And why those differences suggest that cities have a role to play in governance and in democracy and in problem solving that can move us away from the deep pessimism and cynicism we feel about government today. And let me just say a few words about those differences because they're crucial. If you ask a political scientist, I'm supposed to be one, but I don't agree with my colleagues. If you ask a political scientist, what is a city? It will say, the city is the lowest level of government. But it's a level of government. It's a level of administration. And then the province, the département, or the land, or the canton, or the United States, the state. That's the next level. And the highest level of government is the national government, the nation state, they will say. And the city is a level of government subsidiary to the nation state. And in political science terms, that is correct. In terms of sociology, political philosophy, and democracy, that is exactly wrong. Because think for a minute about cities and compare them to states. Think about Paris or Lille or Dijon. Think about Frankfurt or Munich or Berlin. Think about Bristol or Manchester or London. Think about Boston or San Francisco or New York. Think about Damascus and Cairo. Every one of those communities and cities is older, much older than the states they belong to. They were here before nation states. They constitute the essential communities of nation states, and I wager they will be here after nation states as well, because cities are not a level of government. Cities are the essential human community. They define us. Aristotle said man is a zoon politikon. Marx said man is a species being. Ed Glaser, a modern theorist at Harvard, said we are an urban species. We are drawn to community. We are drawn to cities. And from the very beginning, we congregated in cities. So cities are where we're born, where we grow up, where we are educated, where we get married and have children, where we pray, where we play, where we get old and where we die. They are who we are. You might say, je suis française. I might say I'm an American. But you're more likely to say, je suis parisien. I'm more likely to say I'm a New Yorker. And when Kennedy went to Germany, he did say, ich bin Deutscher. He said, ich bin ein Berliner. And that was important because he was identifying with the essential community that represented Germany. And we all do that. We think about our cities. And many of you are business people, I know. And you think about, if I say, where do you do business? You might say, well, I'm part of a French firm or a German bank or an Italian consultancy. But you will also associate with the city where the firm is and where you raise your family, where many of your workers and managers are. That's how we identify ourselves. So cities are very different than just a level of government. And that's why when it comes to governing cities, we have a different set of standards. We have different criteria. Cities are where the real dimensions of government can be seen. Schools, hospitals, police, firemen, sewers, transportation systems. All those things that define our everyday life. Hospitals, universities, cultural institutions. Those are all part of the life of the city and part of our lives. And they define who we are. And we can't do without them. Many of you will remember that a year ago or so, or a little more than a year, the government of the great United States of America closed its doors because of Congress, the Republican Congress, for over a week. And a year earlier, they did it again. So twice in 2 years, the greatest nation on earth closed its government down. Well, the first thing to remember is nobody noticed. They said, what, oh, it's closed, really? Oh, I didn't notice. But do you think you could close New York? Or Louisville or Chicago? The Belgians have in effect had no real national government for years, until recently. But Liège and Bruges, and Brussels, they had government because they have to have government. You can close a state, you can't close a city. And cities have never closed. Not in the Middle Ages during plague and siege and war. Not in World War II, under the worst conditions, because city government is our government, my government, my family's government. We need that government. And so we look at it differently. And the task of politicians in the city, of public officials in the city, is different than the task at the national level. Mayors are pragmatists. Their job is to make things work. And if they don't, you can forget about it. To be a national politician, you don't have to make things work. You have to make beautiful speeches. You have to talk about the beauties of socialism, or the beauties of the market, or the beauties of capitalism. You have to say we should all live to make a profit, or we should all live for the public good. You should say, I'm running for office to put an end to unions that are destroying our country. Or if you're a union guy, you say, I'm running for office to put an end to business, which is destroying the unions. And it's all about ideological conflict. Most of it from the 19th century. 19th century capitalism, 19th century owners and capital versus 19th century unions and workers. And that language, 200 years later almost, is still with us. Even the names of the party, the Socialist Party, the Liberal Party, the Christian Democratic Party, the Conservative Party, the Communist Party, the Farmers Party. It's all around these old terms. But how foolish to talk about capital and labor in an information society, a knowledge society, where what's being produced is not commodities and goods anymore, but knowledge, information, technology. It's a whole different world. And where jobs actually are not, unfortunately, very necessary to keeping society running. Because in the robotic, automated society, we don't actually need labor. So wage labor, which is the essence of the old ideals, is no longer the definition of what it's about. But we still talk that way. Our parties are still organized that way nationally, but not locally, not in the city. Because in the city, the job is to make things happen, to get things done. I tell a story in the book about Teddy Kollek. Do some of you remember Teddy Kollek? He was the mayor of Jerusalem in the 1980s. He was quite a famous mayor. And he was a Zionist, and he didn't like Muslims, and he didn't like Christians. But he was the mayor of a city that was Christian and Muslim and Jewish. And he tells a great story because he would sit in his office, and every week, after the Sabbath, into his office would come rabbis and imams and Christian priests. And they would give him sermons about their historical narratives, why they have a right to access to the holy sites. And they would argue with each other, and they would talk about their comparative histories. And Teddy Kollek, the mayor, would listen, and he would listen, and he would listen. And finally, one day he said, "Gentlemen, gentlemen, please spare me your sermons. Stop giving me sermons about your history. And if you do, I will keep your sewers clean. I will keep your sewers running. Stop with the sermons, and I will give you clean sewers." That's what mayors have to do. They have to give clean sewers, decent hospitals. It's true today. Take the refugee crisis. In Europe, we argue, does the Schengen visa work or not? Why are there so many people in cities without the Schengen visa? Should they be deported? Should they be kept? In the United States, there are 12 million refugees from Latin America without visas. And at the national level, if you follow the primary debates, do we deport them? Do we stop letting them in? Do we send them home? Do we give them a path to citizenship? What do we do? But if you're the mayor of Los Angeles or you're the mayor of New York, they say, I don't know. I can't affect that. It's not my job to let them in or not let them in. But they are here. There are 600,000 illegal immigrants in Los Angeles. There are 300,000 in New York. And I'm the mayor. So my job is to figure out, what do I do? I don't have the authority to deport them or the power. So I have to figure out how to deal with the reality, to find the pragmatic solution. And by the way, New York has found the pragmatic solution. Mayor de Blasio now is offering urban IDs to undocumented workers. Because right now the undocumented workers are there, they use the hospitals, but they actually use the emergency room only, which is very expensive and not very effective. Their kids sometimes don't go to school because they're afraid if the kids go to school, they'll be discovered and they'll be sent away. They, of course, don't register with the police because they're afraid they'll be deported. But that means the police, if there's a crime, can't track them. They're not on the radar. And, of course, they drive. They have to. But they can't get a license because if they get a license, they'll be exposed. So Mayor de Blasio said, you know what? You're here. If the federal government wants to deport you, if Donald Trump gets elected and sends, that's not my problem. But while you are here, I will issue an urban visa, an urban ID to every refugee, to every person here who wants to do it. You have to register with the police. You have to pay taxes. Then you can use the hospitals. You can get a job. You can get a license. And that has been brilliant, and it has really worked well. Because refugees just want to be recognized. All the legal ones, the ones who are decent and hardworking. The criminals won't register, but they wouldn't be there anyway. So there's a practical solution by a mayor who doesn't control the border, who doesn't control whether they come and go, but knows they're there and has to deal with them. By the way, Hamburg, Mayor Olaf Scholz in Hamburg has a similar program. He invites everybody who's an immigrant, legal, illegal, he doesn't ask, register. Register with us. Register with the police, and we will help you lead a normal life like the other citizens of the city. And believe me, if every European city did that with its Muslim immigrant population, you might have a somewhat different view of integration and a somewhat different view of their role as citizens, because we know that the starting place of terrorism is humiliation. The experience of being humiliated, feeling humiliated, is the beginning of hatred, is the beginning of violence, is the beginning of revenge. And treating people like they don't exist, like they're invisible. You know the great American book, The Invisible Man, about blacks in the 1940s. Being invisible, treated like you don't exist, is a terrible thing. And to treat a whole community that way, of course, creates the seeds of extremism and violence and terrorism. So here's a simple, pragmatic solution that mayors have actually been engaged in. So cities in many ways are already acting together to try to deal with the issues that nation states have failed with. Climate change is the same way. Most of you know the C40 climate cities that Michael Bloomberg and Livingston and David Miller of Toronto established 10 years ago. It's working on city cooperation around climate change. ICLEI, the Environmental Issues Group, is even older. It's about 35 years old. It's been working with thousands of cities all over the world on climate change. Here in Paris, there's an organization called EFUS, the European Forum on Urban Security. It's cities that talk together about security, understanding that states aren't very good right now at providing security. So the police departments of cities have started to talk to one another. I tell a story in my book about after 9/11, how Mayor Bloomberg, after the intelligence squad, like most cities, New York has a squad of intelligence detectives doing intelligence exchange and trying to get information about terrorism. They spent 2 years in Washington after 9/11. And they came home after about 2 years and said, we're getting no information, no intelligence. The FBI doesn't help. Interpol doesn't talk to the FBI. It doesn't talk to the French Security Service. Nobody talks to the NRA, the National Research Agency, which is the place that does a lot of the secret research. And so Mayor Bloomberg, who was the mayor of the city, then said, let's not send our intelligence detectives to Washington. Let's send them to Frankfurt and Rio and London and Moscow. Let's put our detectives in touch with other detectives in cities and let the cities exchange information. And by the way, I was just talking to my friend at EFUS today. You know who's doing that today? The French police. Not the French police, sorry, the Paris police and the Brussels police. The French government and the Belgian government are locked in arguments about exchanging information and confidentiality and so forth. But the Paris police, the local police, not the CRS, the local police, and the local police in Brussels are talking to one another. And you know how you get information? You don't put on a helmet and body gear and carry a heavy weapon and march 5 at a time through the streets. You'll see pictures now of the CRS at the Gare du Nord. You'll see pictures of the Belgian National Guard in their heavy uniforms and heavy outfits and armored cars. And they may or may not protect people, but they get no information. The community goes like this. The way you get information is for an ordinary policeman in an ordinary uniform with a little pistol in his side to walk the neighborhood, to talk to people, to go into the stores, to knock on the doors, to become friendly with people, to become trusted. And that's how the police normally get normal information about crime and about gangs. But it's also how the police get information about terrorism. And we know the terrible truth today is that there is almost no viable information about terrorism at the national intelligence levels. They don't get the information, and when they get it, they don't exchange it. So even in the area of Sûreté Nationale, national security, it's the cities that are making real progress together and trying to do this. So all of this led me to this thought. If cities, working one by one, can solve problems pragmatically that states have a hard time doing, and if cities, when they exchange information and work together, can begin to solve larger problems, then what about a global parliament of mayors, a new global governance organization that brings cities from all 5 continents, large and small, north and south, rich and poor, brings them together and begins to face the big global problems. And for people who say, yes, but that cities are about local problems, not about global problems. But in the modern world, local problems are global problems, and global problems are local problems. Climate change is a local problem. 90% of our cities are on water. Rivers, lakes, streams, seas, oceans. Climate change is primarily an urban problem. Refugees, they don't go to farms. They go to the city. It's an urban problem. Terrorism, they don't kill cows, unfortunately. They go where the people are. They go to the big centers of cities. Terrorism is an urban problem. So if you say, what are the big 3 global problems? Well, refugees, terrorism, climate change, that turns out to also be the local problems of cities. I even sort of invented a word for that, global, local and global. These issues, climate change is a global problem. It has local, powerful manifestations, but it is a global issue that we are all concerned with. So if cities work together, maybe they can begin to address together not just their local problems, but also the global problems which are manifested at the local level. And that's, by the way, true of poverty, too. Poverty is a gigantic global issue, but every city has slums, or they call Bétonville, right? This sense of not being able to manage social justice inside. And of course, poverty is also, it's not the only cause of terrorism, but it's connected to that. It's connected to gang warfare, it's connected to drugs, and it's connected to some degree to terrorism as well. So poverty is another problem like that. So what I suggest then in this book, in the last chapter, it was written a couple of years ago, that we try to establish a global parliament of mayors that brings mayors together to try to do together in conjunction with civil society and the private sector to do the things that don't work at the state level. And by the way, many of you are from the private sector here. What's interesting is that the arguments I hear about big government versus big business, markets against government, those happen at the national level. Those are the big ideological issues of the national parties. But where I see partnership between business and public officials is in cities. It's there, because that's where the real partnerships are. We want to build affordable housing, so you go to the developer and say, look, I know you want to make a profit, I know you want to build some wealthy housing, but how about with your wealthy housing, do 20 or 30% affordable housing? And if you do that, we'll give you a permit to build where you won't get the permit otherwise. And so now the housing industry, the developers, which are seen sometimes as predators on people, become part of the solution because they help to create that solution. Banks. You know, we see banks, and many of them are speculative banks. Not Mirova, by the way, but banks that go in for speculation and hedge funds and financial dealing and selling secondary subprime market mortgages bundled together in ways that we know caused the great crisis, 2007-8. But banks historically are there to serve their communities. Loans for business, loans for homeowners, help people start careers, help the city get through a difficult period. And at their best, banks are social entrepreneurs who help the community. And on the way to doing that, they also make some money, which they should, because it's a partnership. So at the local level, at the city level, those partnerships are possible. You know, Bloomberg was a businessman when he came to become mayor of New York. And people said, oh, he'll never work with the unions. But of course he worked with the unions, because you can't make a city flourish if you make war on the unions. And de Blasio is a left-wing guy, and people said, oh God, now he's going to make war on Wall Street and the developers. And in the first months, he did. But within 6 months, it became clear to him that he couldn't make New York work unless he worked with Wall Street, unless he worked with the developers, unless he worked with the banks. And that's what he's doing now, and he's having more success, because that's how cities work. So my sense also is that a global parliament of mayors is a place where there's a much greater appetite for public-private partnerships, for people working together. And banks and developers and corporations and the real estate folks and the people who are anxious to work in harmony and consensus with government have a much better chance to do it with cities than they do at the nation state, where these big ideological parties, left and right, anti-business, pro-business, rule the day. So in every way, it seems to me a global governance institution that complements cities and the UN, complements states, supplements states, but gives cities a larger role, more power, more resources, more jurisdiction. That is a way we can begin once again to make government work, overcome this radical split between the private and the public, between the state and the market, and also reaffirm the belief in democracy. Because the last thing I want to say is that the city, the town, the local level is where democracy works. It's closer to the people. Citizens don't just vote for their governors there, they actually do the hard work of governing. They do referenda, participatory budgeting. Most of you know that term. It started in Latin America as part of the anti-globalization movement, Puerto Alegre. But now participatory budgeting has spread to 300 or 400 cities all over the world, including Paris. And Paris gives about 5% of its budget to participatory budgeting, which means they enlist the public and say, how do you want the money spent? You can compete for it, your ideas. Don't criticize us for how we spend it. You go ahead and spend it. You make the hard decisions. You do the hard arguments with your fellow citizens about how to spend it. So cities are finally also more democratic. And we see that in an extraordinary statistic. When you ask people around the world, do you trust your president or prime minister, 70% say no. When you ask, do you trust your mayor, your district councilor, 70% say yes. There's much greater trust at the local level. Of course there is, because mayors are your neighbors. Mayors are your fellow citizens. They live in the city with you. So not only do cities solve problems and work well in a private, public sense, but they are sources of democratic revival and the democratic spirit. And young people and people of color and single women and gays who are cynical about big government and about big business too will say, but the city is a place where it looks like it works. So the city can rekindle our belief in democracy, localism. When the great Frenchman de Tocqueville went to the United States in the 1930s, he went to study the new federal government. But very quickly he changed his mind. He decided studying the federal government isn't what he wanted to do, and he started instead to go to the cities and the towns. And at the end of his tour, when he wrote that great book, Democracy in America, the most important single phrase in that book is liberté et municipale. Liberty is local. It starts and ends in the community with citizens. Citoyenneté, cité, the same etymology. That's where it starts. So cities are deeply democratic and deeply liberal, deeply free, which is, by the way, why terrorists hate them, because they represent everything that is a danger to terror: multiculturalism, diversity, openness, and tolerance. So I celebrate cities. I celebrate what they can do, and I think if they have a greater role in government, they're more empowered. The things they do well, democracy, public-private partnerships, and problem solving, can help resolve both the governance crisis and the democratic crisis, and even in these very dark times that we're living in right now, give us real hope. Thank you.
En France, il y a un élargissement des villes. On parle plutôt maintenant de métropole. Le même discours, la même pensée s'applique à la dimension métropole ou à la dimension ville. On a un sentiment en France qu'il y a une dilution entre la ville et la métropole, et on réinvente un nouvel État qui s'appelle la métropole par rapport à la ville. Est-ce que, malgré tout, d'autres expériences nous aident à penser que la ville s'élargit, mais ça reste la ville?
That's a wonderful and an important question, because you are right. There are two divisions, not just the division between the old inner city and the metropole, but between city and country as well. We talk about in France, la France profonde. And in America, agricultural, rural America controls Congress, and the Congress controls a majority of the population that live in cities. So you have two divisions, city and country, and then the division between cities and those on the outlying. And one, and this leads to your question, one approach has been, let's try to enlarge the city so it includes the metropolitan region, the metropole, as with Grand Paris, for example. But also in Italy, Matteo Renzi, he was the mayor of Florence, by the way. He got his ideas from being the mayor of Florence. And when he became prime minister, he said, let's organize Italy, not around the old provinces of Tuscany and so on, and not around cities. There are too many and they're separated and they don't include the suburbs of the country. Let's create 9 metro regions, 9 metropole, around Bologna and Torino and Milano and Genoa and Rome. And we will represent those in the Senate. Now, that helped overcome the country-city division in a powerful way. But of course, what it does is it internalizes the conflicts. When you enlarge the city, the conflict between city and suburb just gets internalized. Now the conflict is within the city, within the metropole, instead of outside. So it doesn't solve the problem, but it is a step in the right direction. Because to appeal to cities is not to do away with conflict. Conflict is the essence of politics. Our friend Jean-Jacques Rousseau said a long time ago, if you don't have conflict, you don't need politics. We all just agree and we go about our business. Politics is about conflict, and the conflict between the inner city, the périphérique, the banlieue, the agricultural hinterland, those are all the political conflicts we have to deal with. But structure can play a role. And my own view is if you create the metropolitan districts, the larger metro regions, that is a step in the right direction, because by internalizing the conflict inside these new organizations, you force people to deal with it. When it's separate, you can choose sides. I'm on the side of the banlieue, I'm on the side of the countryside, or I'm on the side of the city. Here, you're forced to say it's one unit, and we have to figure out how to do it. So it doesn't solve the problem, it's a very real problem, and there's no solution that doesn't have problems. But I think it's an important approach, and if I wrote the book today, I would not say si les villes gouvernées, I'd say si les métropoles gouvernées, and then talk about the problems that you suggested inside. So it's an important question, and one we have to deal with. But I don't think it vitiates, I don't think it changes the fact that cities and metropolitan regions can play a much more important role than they do right now.
Thank you very much for this presentation. It was very fascinating. My question is about what is your opinion on the role of tech in all of this? For example, I would say revolution led by cities, but not only techs, but also more specifically the role of city techs in.
Right. I'm ambivalent because on the one hand, technology is a great instrument of change, of modernization, of implementation, and even of democracy. We talk about digital democracy and the possibilities of democracy on the web and so on. We talk about smart cities a lot. And there are a lot of good things that technology can do to improve governance, without question. Big data even can be very valuable because gathering and using data is a way to make cities more efficient and so on. But here's what I want to warn. I have a caveat, I have a warning. Smart technology is only as smart as the politicians and citizens who use it. Let me say something absolutely horrible, but true. The German concentration camp was a use of smart technology. They figured out how to kill people extremely efficiently using cyclone gas and other new methods. You might say that was a smart concentration camp in our sense of technology. Use technology to enhance the purpose. So we have to ask always, what is the purpose? Just because you have a technical solution, you have to know what is the purpose, what is it for? Because sometimes a smart technology actually turns out to be stupid. Let me give you a very concrete example. Many cities use smart parking meters, right? Those are meters that on your car you can see, oh, there's an empty meter over there. And instead of driving around and using petrol, you go park. And that's very smart because it saves people driving around. But here's the trouble. If the real goal is to stop people from using their cars, smart meters encourage you to use your car. Says, oh, I'll get a parking place easy. If you have no meters at all and no parking places, then people stop using their cars because they can't do it. So this smart technology actually has the opposite effect of what it tries to do. It tries to get people to use less petrol, to be more green, but it actually encourages the use of cars because it makes it easier to park. So we have to think very carefully about what the purposes are and whether it's really serving it. So yes, technology has a role, but smart technology is only as smart as the public officials and the citizens are who use it. In that case, we have to be a little bit careful because a lot of people get used to the idea, oh, technology, it's the savior. Technology will save our city. It will save our budget. It will make for safety and so on. And technology, one way you deal with terrorism is surveillance. London today has 3,000 to 4,000 cameras in the metro, on the streets. New York is imitating it. Paris will follow. Now, if you have cameras everywhere, and maybe you have IIDs and so on, so you can begin to identify bad guys, that means the end of a private society. That means a surveillance society. That means, the beginning of everybody being watched. Now, maybe the price of containing terrorists is that everybody has to be watched all the time, but we have to understand that there are costs and so on. So, technology, yes, but it's complex, it's difficult, and it takes a lot of strong, critical thinking to use it well. Does that answer the question?
Partly.
Maybe at dinner we can talk more.
Yeah.
You're all getting hungry. I know one more last question. So does anyone, what I'd love to know, I know it's hard to raise hands, but how many people say, well, that's an interesting idea worth exploring? Raise your hand. Worth, see. Or how many say, that's a bad idea, really stop right here, that's enough?
I'm something in between. So,
okay, that's
talking about I'm wrong, by the way. So, so are you talking about the kind of delegation of authority? Because if you look at the big things that happens, right? Take Katrina, take Fukushima, take the financial crisis, or the war in Syria bringing refugees. I mean, there is no way that cities can solve the matter. They can compensate some of the drawbacks, some of the consequences of that. But in terms of, or take private climate, right? You said you want to put the mayors of large and small towns in the same room. So you didn't say room, but you meant place, right? So you need what? 3 million people in a room, 4 million, and and I think that all. I mean, let's say governance. I think it's about resource allocation and decision making. Can you imagine having 4 million people are getting resources to take decisions? At one point, somebody will say, you know what? We'll take it at buckets of 100,000, right? And then they realize that this is not big enough. And so and at the end there will be the United Nations room, right? And still not being able to decide anything. So I think
in a word, the problem of scale. Right? That's why we got nation states, the problem of scale. Too many citizens just for the city, we need the nation state. Too many citizens for the nation state, we need Europe. Too many citizens and so we get the global scale. But here's the thing, there are a couple things to say about that. 2 people who fundamentally disagree will have a harder time reaching agreement than 1,000 people who have a similar outlook. Right? I mean, that's very important. And one of the things about cities is I am suggesting there is an urban perspective. And the urban perspective means you start, not with consensus. Of course, there's all kinds of disagreements about interests and so on. But you start with a much greater sense. I'll give you an example. In America, there are 30% of the population of politicians who are climate deniers. There is no climate change. It's a hoax. There is not one mayor in the United States who is a climate denier. Because mayors know better. Because they see the consequences for their people. So if you get people who are climate deniers together with people who believe in climate science, you have an endless argument, even with 5 people. But if you get 1,000 mayors together who all start, climate science is real, what can we do about climate change? It's not going to be so hard. That's number one. Number 2, this comes back to smart technology. There's no way you can get more than 100 people in a room, certainly not 1,000. But digital technology allows us, we already have things like Google Hangouts. We have Skype for a few people. But there are digital technologies that allow us to simulate a genuine debate, caucusing, deliberation, and voting where you can have far more than just 100 or 500 people in the room. We are working with tech firms right now to develop that technology, because you're right, we know that if you get 1,000 mayors, let alone 10,000 mayors interested, you can't put them in a room or a stadium and have a discussion. The other thing you said, but you see, you answered your own question. You say, well, we put them in buckets. You know what that's called? It's called federalism. Putting people in buckets at different levels. So you have Switzerland, 7 million people, but you have 22 cantons. America's 350 million people, you have 50 states. And then the states are in districts and the districts are in towns. So you put them, yes, in buckets, and the buckets meet and agree within the buckets, and then the buckets and so on all the way up. That's how federalism works, and it's a brilliant system because it's how we learn to deal with scale, how we learn to deal with large numbers. And we did it in the United States. And one of the problems France has and England has is that they're not federations. They're unitary systems. So it's all one thing, you know, without, and beginning now to change. England now has a system of devolution of power down. The Conservatives, the Tories, David Cameron has actually said, let's devolve power to the cities. But they still don't really have the federal system. So federalism helps a lot. I think ultimately, if the governance system of mayors works, it's going to have to be federated. It will have to be to some degree in those buckets, and it will have to be digitalized. It'll have to be virtual. You'll have to have a lot of virtual meetings. Mayors can't leave their towns every 6 months and go have an argument in a parliament and somewhere else. They'll have to be able to do it in City Hall. So there are a lot of big questions, but let me end with this. You know, I'm a 60s guy, as you can probably tell. 68. And in America, we used to say, I was in the peace movement there, I was against the Vietnam War and so on. And we used to sing, all we are saying is give peace a chance. You might remember that. All we are saying is give peace a chance. And today my mantra is, all I am saying is give cities a chance. There's many problems, there's many obstacles, but let's give cities a chance. It's clear they can do better than they've done, and probably better than states are doing, and we will all benefit by the chance. Thank you very much.